So maybe you're deciding between the Nikon Z9 and the Nikon Z8. Well, the good news is both of those cameras are absolutely outstanding. They're very, very similar in a lot of different ways, but there are some differences and they might help you decide between the two cameras. So we're going to look at what are the main differences between the Nikon Z9 and the Nikon Z8. And how can you decide which one is the right one for you? So before we actually dive into the differences, let's just talk about some of the similarities that they share. We'll just go through these quickly because there's so many of them, to be honest. They're very, very much the same kind of camera. The Z8 is kind of a baby Z9. I think most people are calling it that, to be honest. So the same 45 megapixel full frame BSI stacked sensor, same processor. Neither of them have a mechanical shutter. They're both very, very fast. So 20 frames a second in RAW, and that's at full resolution as well, or 120 frames a second in JPEG at a slightly lower resolution. They've both got this extremely good hybrid autofocus system, which we first saw in the Z9, but in the Z8 again, it's very, very good. The video capabilities are amazing. We're talking 4K up to 120 frames a second, 8K up to 60 frames a second. You can shoot in RAW, you can shoot in ProRes, you can shoot 422 10 bits. You've got N-Log in there as well. Both have 5-axis image stabilization up to 6 stops. And I've got to say, it is extremely good. So if you're shooting handheld video, ooh, yes. And both have a beautiful OLED viewfinder, which looks fantastic. It's 3.69 million dots, which looks great. It's not the highest resolution we've ever seen, but you can't fault it really. So let's talk about some of the differences between these two cameras, and we'll start with the bigger differences, the more obvious, and the ones that are probably going to mean more to you as either a photographer, a videographer, or a hybrid shooter. The first obvious one is the size and the weight. The Z9 is bigger, it's heavier than the Z8. Depending on how you're going to use it, either one might have advantages. For me personally, I quite like the Z8. I like that it's a little bit smaller. I like that it's a little bit lighter. Now this plays massively into the feel of the cameras as well. They're both hybrid cameras, so photo and video. And I've said in the review that they don't feel like you're really compromising on either. These can be absolutely a photography first camera or absolutely a video first camera, just depending on how you want to use it. But for me, and this is completely a personal opinion, using the Z8 felt more like a solid hybrid camera just because of the shape, the size, the weight, whereas the Z9 felt a little bit more photography orientated just because of the size of it. I felt like I should be out on a hike and shooting wildlife and doing all kinds of stuff with it like that. Realistically, they're both incredible at both photo and video, but they just feel a little bit different because of that size. The actual weight of the Z9 is 1,340 grams versus 910 grams on the Z8. But that extra size does mean the Z9 does have more physical controls. So it's able to, fit more in there, both on the back and the front, which is a nice thing depending on how you want to use the camera. Another aspect which is really, really big with the difference between these two cameras is the battery. The Z8 uses the kind of standard battery that you see in cameras like the Z6 and the Z7, and it's absolutely fine. I never had a problem with it, but the Z9 battery, this will absolutely last a lot longer. The actual ratings for the battery are 340 shots on the EVF with the Z8 versus 740 shots on the EVF with the Z9. Now those ratings, usually I find them to be, they're a little bit on the low side, and actually you can probably get a lot more out of the battery, but that still gives you a great idea of how much bigger the Z9 battery is. So whether you are going out doing photography, doing video, you aren't going to be run out of battery nearly as fast on the Z9, that's a big deal. There's a difference in terms of the continuous video recording time. So for example, the Z8 can shoot 4K 60 frames a second for around 2 hours, or 8K 30 for about 90 minutes, whereas the Z9 has no recording time limit on 4K, and it can shoot 8K for around 2 hours. That implies that the size of the Z9 allows it to dissipate heat a little bit better. And something else to bear in mind with that as well, of course, if you're shooting 8K for 2 hours or 4K for more than 2 hours, you're going to need a lot of storage, but also the battery life is important to mention again, because the amount of time you're going to be able to shoot continuous video on one battery is almost double. I mean, it's not far off double the time on the Z9 versus the Z8. So that is something to consider. That said, most videographers probably won't ever run up against the time limits. Like for example, 2 hours at 4K is probably fine. There are very few situations where you're going to need to be continuously recording longer than that. And the idea of shooting even 90 minutes at 8K, I just think about the storage space that would require. And for me personally, that's probably not too much of a concern. But if it's something that is going to be factored into how you use the camera, It's worth noting. The memory is slightly different on both cameras as well. So for example, the Z8 has one CF Express Type B card slot and then one SD UHS-2 card slot, which I think is great. I mean, that's a nice thing to have, CF Express Type B, so you can do that for your kind of fast shooting or your video at high frame rates, 4K 120 or 8K, whereas the Z9 has two CF Express Type B card slots. I think that's fine. I think if you're gonna get a camera like this, I just can't imagine a situation where you wouldn't be using CF Express Type B, because you want to be taking advantage of all that the camera can offer. It's nice to have that SD card slot on the Z8 because it allows you to have a little bit of a backup like that. But personally, either of these cameras, I would be switching completely over to CF Express Type B just for the speed. So I think it makes sense to have both of them be CF Express Type B on the Z9. The connections are also very slightly different between the two cameras as well. The Z8 has two USB-C connections, so you can actually split it between power and then data. So you can actually power the camera via one of the USB-C slots, and then actually either transfer data via the other one, or you can leave that free for an accessory that uses USB-C as well. Whereas on the Z9, you have an Ethernet or a LAN port as well. So that's quite useful. You can replicate that on the Z8 by using a USB-C to Ethernet adapter. But that kind of just depends on what's going to be most useful for you. Also worth noting, the Z9 has a built-in GPS, which is pretty cool, whereas the Z8 doesn't have that. It's also worth pointing out there's new firmware on the Z9, which gives it some interesting new capabilities that we haven't seen yet on the Z8. So things like the auto capture mode, which essentially turn this into probably the best trap camera that you could have. This allows you to set various criteria for when the camera might take a photo. But for example, if you set it up and it detects a certain subject, it'll start taking photos. There's a lot to that firmware update. And I've actually had the chance to speak to a few people who own a Z9, and they say it feels like a new camera. We're actually hopefully going to get our hands on a Z9 to test out that new firmware update, I think in the near future, so we can really kind of see what it's all about, because that looks very interesting. But that is another plus point for the Z9. And of course, then a massive difference between the two cameras is the price. The Z8 is considerably less expensive than the Z9, but in many ways offering very similar performance. So I think it really comes down to what you want to use this camera for. For someone like me, personally, I would probably go for the Z8 because for the most part, I'm either filming in here, I'm filming out and about, I could take a spare battery, that's probably not going to be too much of a problem. I very rarely go through 2 batteries worth of power on any camera that I use in one shoot without having the chance to recharge, so that wouldn't really affect me. And having used the Z8, I've got to say it's one of my favorite cameras really that I've ever used. That said, of course, that applies to the Z9 as well. I love the Z9. It is such a lovely camera. For me, the size and the weight advantage of the Z8 being smaller works really well in my favor, but for some people, they will like a slightly bigger camera. For example, I think if you're shooting wildlife and you're gonna be using long lenses, the Z9 might just feel better in the hands. But to be completely honest with you, and I know this isn't much of a helpful answer, you really can't go wrong with either of these cameras. Both of these cameras are gonna afford you just unbelievable capabilities, whether you shoot photo or video. I mean, you want to talk about future proofing. These are really set up to be able to be very relevant and very capable for a long time. Let me know though, which one is piquing your interest? Which one do you want to go for? Which one do you want in the camera bag? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know, and let me know why as well, because it's super interesting. You can check out both the Z8 and the Z9 by following links down in the description where you can see the full spec, the pricing, all that fun stuff. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. There's new content all the time. I will see you in the next video, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.